So the traveling salesman problem, it's simple. Suppose you want to visit, say, 7 sites in Brno and come back to your starting point. So you want to find the shortest possible circular tour that visits the point you selected. That's it. I mean, it sounds crazy simple, but in fact, the traveling salesman problem, or TSP for short, I'll refer to it, is one of the most studied and famous problems in applied math and computer science. Hollywood's take on it is that
what you're describing is a hacking algorithm on a scale like nothing ever earthly devised. An entire dimension has been controlled. You can't lock it away.
So their take on it is that you solve the salesman problem, you save the world or control the world. That's an over-the-top thriller based on the consequences of a very fast algorithm for solving the problem. See, the title of the movie comes from the use of the TSP as sort of the poster child for complexity or problems that are impossible to solve. For example, several years ago at the World Economic Forum in Davos, they put out a report on the future of supercomputing. Their one-line summary mentions the TSP. Or in AI computing. So that's the chairman CEO of NVIDIA. He's giving a keynote address to some 250,000 developers. And he's using the traveling salesman problem to describe the power of the hardware. This is only 2 years ago that he was doing this. His target application was the logistics industry. So there's over 400 billion packages that are delivered to homes each year. And they're delivered by van drivers following TSP tours. So in quantum computing, the private company that has the largest market capitalization, some 23 billion US dollars, they're selling quantum computers. They made a list of all their possible applications. The top one over in the corner is optimal routing. So finding routes for van drivers. Right? So this van drivers is sort of the iconic example these days of the TSP, because we all see those vans driving up and delivering packages to people's homes, following the routes. Amazon, they of course have their own van company now, so their own drivers. And for them, finding short and safe routes for the drivers to follow is important enough that they ran a worldwide competition with a $100,000 prize, attracted over 2,000 teams, all trying to find better routing algorithms for them. And it's not just moving people and equipment. This model is so simple that it arises in many other occasions, like in genome sequencing or machine scheduling, data analysis. Probably, anytime when you have something that you have to put something in order, might be a TSP. What I'm showing are some of the companies that have requested licenses for our Concord TSP solver, our software, written together with Dave Applegate, Bob Bixby, and Vasek Kvatel. Kvatel, by the way, is now working in Prague. He was raised in Prague, and he went in the US and Canada, and now he's back in Prague. Yeah, so these companies, when I ask for a license, what I request is that they tell me how they're going to use it. That's before we give them permission. They have to describe to me how they're going to use it. And that way I learn about a new application every week or so, which is quite nice. But I'm clearly not much of a businessman. Notice up in the corner is NVIDIA. That's the most valued company now in America. In 2010, NVIDIA asked for a license to use our solver, and the application was in their chip design process. So they offered $25,000, and I took that as a grant I got some graphics cards, high-end graphics cards to test in optimization work. So just the other month, I asked ChatGPT what would happen if I instead asked for $25,000 in stock. And it says it would be now worth $462 million. So I'm obviously not a businessman. I got a couple of graphics cards. I could have had $462 million. But it was still a nice application. I mean, so I'm still happy with it. I quite like the variety of companies that make use of the software. But one thing I don't like is no traveling salesman has ever asked me for permission to use the code. I mean, that's a little disappointing. In the old days, the salesman really did care about that. This is from a German book from 1832. And the book describes routes that he proposes that salesmen follow when they're in Germany. And I quite like that. So it's traveling salesman himself. It's an old-fashioned German, but it means traveling salesman. It's a traveling salesman himself trying to solve the TSP. But notice he says, we believe that it's short as possible. He realizes he doesn't know that it's short as possible. The trouble is this is 44 points that he's going through, 44 cities. He knows that there's just too many possibilities, and he didn't check them all. You can see that for yourself very easily, how many tours there are. So consider you have 5 points. It's a circular tour, so it doesn't matter where you start. So you have 4 choices for the first point to visit, then 3 choices for the second, 2 choices for the first, and then for the third, and then only 1 choice for the last one. So altogether you have 4 factorial, 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, so 24 possible tours. Notice that the patterns are repeated twice, like the pentagon, because you have a tour going one direction or the other direction. So if you have an application where the direction of travel doesn't matter, then you only have half that many. So there's only 12 undirected tours on 5 points, very few. But if you have 22 points, you have 25 billion tours. And that's far too many to check one by one, even on a fastest supercomputer. And for the popular press, that means that the traveling salesman problem is impossible. So what I'm going to show you is a clip from the most watched television program, night television program in the US. It's Stephen Colbert, and this is his opening monologue just from September. And he's going to make a joke about the traveling salesman problem.
Tech companies want the helium-3 because it's needed to build quantum computers, which are way faster than our current computers. For instance, for the math problem, a salesperson must travel to 22 cities, visiting each city only once and returning to the first city in the most efficient route. A laptop computer would take about 1,000 years to figure it out. But a quantum computer could one day compute the solution in minutes. Totally worth fracking the moon.
See, this is about an article in the Washington Post that described this. They actually sold a license for people to mine helium on the moon. I don't know who gets paid. I know who owns the moon, but somehow this company now has the rights to do this. And in an article, they are quoting this 1,000-year claim for a 22-city problem. That's actually repeating an article that appeared earlier in 2018 in the Washington Post. I responded to that earlier article on what was then called Twitter, saying that in fact it takes 0.005 seconds, not 1,000 years. And this got enough attention that the author of that Washington Post article contacted me. We traded email, and I thought he understood, but he never retracted the article. And so now it gets repeated again, the same claim that takes 22 years. So just as a sanity check, I asked ChatGPT, well, how long does it take? And ChatGPT actually gets it right. It's 1,600 years. That is how long it would take if you checked every tour one by one. But it goes on and say that there's other methods, including they recommend our solver. The Concord, our code is called Concord, our exact solver for the TSP. And that's the point. Maybe there's too many tours to check one by one, but why would you want to do it that way? Like suppose you have n numbers to sort. That's n factorial possible orderings. Well, you don't do all the possible permutations and figure out the one that's correct, right? There's other ways to sort. Similarly, you might hope that there's other ways to solve the traveling salesman problem. This was actually exactly the question that was raised by Carl Menger in 1930. So he wanted to know, he's talking about the geometric version of the TSP. He wanted to know, can you do it quicker than n factorial, quicker than checking every permutation one by one? This is actually a deep question. He wants a better than finite algorithm. You have to think of the time, 1930. This is well before Turing machines or any notion of complexity. And it was a very interesting time for math. So in Vienna, Carl Menger was the mentor of Bernoulli's own Kurt Gödel. And it was at just this time when Gödel had his great result on incompleteness. So Gödel's getting at the foundations of logic. Menger's is starting to talk about complexity. In the 1950s, Gödel himself repeats Menger's question in a now famous letter to John von Neumann. Okay, maybe not known to the popular press, Menger's question was actually settled in 1962. There's a way to solve the TSP that's much faster than n factorial. So Bellman and independently Helton Karp use dynamic programming, which means you start with little pieces of the problem and grow them into the full pass. That solves the TSP, an n-city TSP, in n squared times 2 to the power n time. That's much faster than n factorial. I mean, for n equals 22, that's a small number now. That's why they can be solved so fast. The TSP on 22 points can be solved so quickly. But that 2 to the n, that still is an exponential factor, so it's not going to be satisfactory for large problems. So for n equals 50, you can't run Bellman-Held-Carp. Okay, so I'm not satisfied with an exponential growth. What I would be satisfied with? Well, the gold standard was set down by John von Neumann. In 1951, he developed an algorithm, not for the TSP, but for a relaxed version of the TSP called the assignment problem. And he showed that his algorithm runs in n cubed time, not n factorial. And so a strengthened form of Menger's question would be, can you solve it in, say, n squared time or n cubed time, so n raised to some fixed power, so a polynomial time algorithm. All right, that's a strengthened form of this question, but in the mid-1950s, Merle Flood, who's a great pioneer in operations research, starts to believe that maybe it's impossible. He's looking for impossibility results. By the mid-1960s, Jack Edmonds flat out conjectures there'll never be a polynomial time algorithm for the TSP. That's what he means by good. He defined good to be polynomial time. Come 1970s now, gets tied up, Edmonds' conjecture gets tied up in the great P versus NP question, so one of the big open questions in mathematics. The Clay Math Foundation has money that if you find a fast TSP algorithm, say n-cubed algorithm, you'll get $1 million. Or if you can prove that there is no polynomial time algorithm, you also get $1 million. It's an open question. Hollywood, of course, wants the question to be P is equal to NP. They want a really fast algorithm. Then that's the way they get their thriller movies. But actually, we're not even inching towards a polynomial time algorithm. The best known complexity for the TSP is still Bellman-Held-Carp, going back to 1962. So 63 years, we haven't improved that 2 to the n to even say 1.99 to the n. We're not even inching towards a polynomial time algorithm. Okay, so you can ask, well, all right, you're asking maybe a too hard question to get the shortest possible. What if you relax a little bit and just say, yeah, I'd be okay if you give me a tour that's just within, say, a small fraction of optimal. Well, even that you can't do in polynomial time. But if you have a special case, which is called the triangle inequality, then there's a 1.5 approximation. So you can get a tour that's guaranteed to be no more than 1.5 times the shortest tour. So 50% off, maybe. The triangle inequality is natural. It says that go from A to B shouldn't be any longer than going from A to C to B. So going on a detour shouldn't make it any shorter, which is natural because your distance from A to B should be the shortest distance. So it's quite natural. When you have that, then you can develop a tour by first connecting the points in a tree, then using a matching, which is pairing up points, to connect the tree up into a tour. The tour is 1.5, guaranteed to be 1.5 times, no more than 1.5 times the shortest tour. Like Bellman-Held-Carp, it's a simple algorithm, but it stood the test of time. 44 years and there's no improvement. But notice if you can do your subtracting, notice I didn't say 49 years. Because in 2020, there was an epsilon improvement. Very difficult method, so 70-page proof, very sophisticated methods, but it got below 1.5. So really cool theoretical result. But both of these results, you have to keep in mind, these are not meant to be implemented in practice. These are not practical results. These are just theoretical results. No one really wants a tour that's 50% longer than you need. So suppose you want to just, see all of the Czech Republic. I don't care about any fancy math guarantees. Just give me a good tour. Well, that's actually a big problem in study, a popular problem in study. So you're just trying to find good tours without any guarantee that they're short as possible or even close to being short. You just want to get as good a tours as you can possibly get. This is so popular that there's even biologists that make studies on showing how small creatures can find tours through small number of points, 4 or 5 points, and with high quality. That's interesting biology and quite fun, but you shouldn't believe, like apparently the musician Brian Eno does, that that's the way you should solve a TSP. If you have to solve a TSP, you shouldn't ask slime mold to do it for you. You're much better to try to apply modern heuristic techniques. Sticking with the animal kingdom, Curious George knows the main trick.
Floor leaves, clean a garage, wash the windows, stack some cans. What's the matter?
What George doesn't like is the tour crosses itself. And because of the Pythagorean theorem, you should not do that. You should delete the uncrossing edges and reconnect the paths. You get a shorter tour. Simple argument, but Merrill Flood turned that into an algorithm called 2-op. Forget about the geometry. He just says, try deleting any two edges and reconnecting the paths. If that's shorter, then you should do that. So it's a local search. You look around, see if you can delete two edges to improve your tour. And he calls that a 2-op algorithm. Watch how it improves that bad tour. Just repeatedly fixing up pairs of edges quickly turns a bad tour into a good tour. So it's local search, like hill climbing. I want to find the highest place in this room where I just see, well, that step, I should go there. Then I might jump up onto the table and then eventually get to the table at the back of the room. So it's a hill climbing method. His simple 2-op algorithm had a great improvement in the 1970s by Shedlin and Brian Kerningham. They did a marvelous job of engineering a method that can look at k-op steps for large values of k. So deleting k edges and reconnecting the tour. You can see how it very quickly takes that random tour and turns it into a good tour. So there's been a long list of improvements in this local search methods. The champion by far now is Kjeld Helsken's LKH code. Kjeld Helsken is from Denmark. His code is marvelous. I mean, it finds really good tours even for large problems. It comes to no one guarantee, but if you want a good tour, that's the algorithm you should use. Kjeld and I, to try to push the limits of his method, we worked on several years ago on a problem with the 3D location of some 2 million stars. And we had found a tour that's within a whisker of optimality. I mean, it's not the shortest, maybe not the shortest possible, but we know it's very, very close. It's like planning a driving tour between here and Prague that's maybe 1 meter too long. So it's very close to optimal. And the main ingredient there was local search. Local search was also the main ingredient in our submission to this Amazon contest. The Amazon contest was interesting that they didn't want shortest tours. What they wanted is short tours that the drivers were happy to follow. Because the drivers have their own experience, and they might know that there's some big, I happen to see a big mean dog today, so I was thinking about that. The street might have a big mean dog that you don't want to park your truck on that. So the drivers, you give them the tour and they don't follow it. They do something different. So in the contest, what Amazon did is they gave all the participants 6,000 tours that Amazon was happy with and drivers were happy with. So they're short and the drivers follow them. And then the idea was to use machine learning techniques, neural networks, to try to reproduce those tours. So in the contest, then you were judged by 3,000 tours that you hadn't seen before. And the tours were scored on how closely you matched the driver's tour, where you try to get a lower the score, the better. Matching the driver's tour exactly would give you a 0. So in our approach to it, together with Kjeld Helsken and Stefan Held from Bonn in Germany, was that we didn't really do any machine learning, but we did some simple observations on developing rules that drivers seem to follow, about how they move from zones to zones across the city. And then we used local search that not only tried to make the tour shorter, it also penalized any time you violated these rules. All right, and if you read the description of the contest, it's clear that they wanted you to use machine learning techniques. So there's to outperform traditional optimization-driven operations research, which is what I do for a living. They wanted to say that we're not important anymore. So I was quite happy that we actually won the contest. We won $100,000. Not only win $100,000, we're 40% better than the second place team. So what's not to like? Well, there is something I didn't like. They include that sentence down the bottom on all their publications, all the announcements about this, that the TSP is NP complete, mean that in all but the simplest instances, it's computationally intractable. Oh, I really didn't like that. So for a number of years now, we're trying to preach the opposite is true, that because it's NP hard, NP complete means that as n goes off to infinity, there may be some real examples that we'll never be able to solve. It doesn't mean that you have an example you want solved, that I can't solve that example. It just means that maybe there's some bad examples, right? So a question is it really impossible to solve my example? All right, going that, actually that's me. I did do that little tour this morning, if you were wondering. That example, that was bad in a sense that that's only 7 points. And well, you could just list the 6 factorial tours and find the best one. So that's not a good example. Suppose instead you wanted to climb every mountain in the Czech Republic. So there's 462 peaks that are registered on some website that I found. Now, clearly, 472 peaks, 471 factorial is far too many to check. Nonetheless, I computed the shortest way to walk. It takes 44 days to walk to all those mountains. Not only that, and it only took under a second on my Mac Mini. Mac Mini is a little computer, fits on the hand. And not only found the tour, it proved that that's as short as possible. So clearly I didn't check all that tours, I did something different. Just like in sorting, we did something different. So I don't claim that we can solve every big example of the traveling salesman problem, but I solved that one. This sort of get it done view of the problem goes back to Haster-Whitney. Haster-Whitney was a great mathematician. He invented matroids, for example. What he did for the TSP is to bring the problem home to something you sort of put your arms around. So this was just after, he clearly learned the problem from Menger. This is 1934, just a few years after Menger. And the two did meet at Harvard. When Whitney gave the talk at Princeton, he didn't talk about asymptotic complexity. He said, the traveling salesman problem is the problem of finding the shortest way to visit the 48 states. So it became known as the 48 states problem. The TSP name hadn't been invented yet. So it became known as Whitney's 48 states problem. And it's his viewpoint that it was picked up a decade later by Julian Robinson. Now, Robinson, you may know her name. So she's the most famous for leading the team that solved Hilbert's 10th problem. But as a postdoc, she worked at an optimization group and focused on the TSP, and not on asymptotic complexity. Right? She's trying to use her mathematics to make improvements on, say, n equals 50, so small finite examples. And it's her work that directly led to the first big breakthrough. In 1954, George Danzig, Selmer Johnson, and Ray Fulkerson, they actually solved with by-hand computations the 48 states problem. So they found the tour and proved that it's short as possible. And it's remarkable. That's the newspapers and late-night television says that that's impossible to do, even with the fastest supercomputers. They did it by hand. And it was a big deal at the time. I mean, press forgets things, so now we say it's impossible. But at the time, it was in many, many publications. And they were spot on saying that the main tool was linear programming. Linear programming had been invented by Danzig a few years before that. It's a simple model. You minimize a linear function subject to linear inequality constraints. So the math of it is like linear algebra for inequality systems. Very simple model. But its simplicity allows it to be used in many, many applications. It's one of the big success stories of applied math of the last century. You pretty much can't pick up any product where linear programming is not somehow used in its manufacture, design, or delivery. For example, Danzig's algorithm, the simplex algorithm for linear programming, was named one of the top 10 algorithms of the century. And not for its complexity or geometric beauty, but for its application. Right? It's the only problem that's described as that way, for its one of the most successful algorithms of all time. And much of that success you can trace back to the TSP paper, the 1954. They introduced something called the cutting plane method that greatly expanded the reach of linear programming. And I like to describe that, but I like to use geometry rather than algebra, using an idea that was proposed by Michael Younger and Bill Pooley-Blank. So this is a nice, colorful picture. But it's not just pretty colors, although I do like the colors. That's actually a proof that tour I drew is short as possible. So let me zoom in on it. You notice around each point I have a blue disk, and all the disks are disjoint. Now, any salesman has to visit that point, so it has to cross the radius of that disk twice. Any tour is going to have a length at least twice the radius. And those are disjoint, so the sum of all those radii, that's a lower bound on the TSP, has to be at least that long. And look at these other regions, like that yellow region, that traps a subset of points. So again, a salesman has to cross that band at least twice. It might cross it more, but at least twice. So you can add twice the sum of the widths of those bands that are also disjoint. And this particular problem, you can get out a ruler and realize that, well, the length of the tour is exactly matches that lower bound. But you don't need to measure, it's easier than that. Just notice that each structure is crossed like that red one, is crossed exactly twice, and each edge is completely covered by the structures. Those two facts together means that the length of the tour is equal to the bound. So that's an optimal TSP solution. And this is just an illustration of a duality theory for linear programming that was developed by von Neumann. So linear programming problems come in pairs. So the original problem called the primal, you're trying to minimize. You're trying to push down the length of the tour as much as you can. The dual problem you're trying to maximize. And the two are constructed so that if you have a solution to the dual, you can never push the primal below it. So any solution of the dual gives you a lower bound on the primal. And the cool thing von Neumann proved is that if you push the primal as far as you can, push the dual as far as you can, then you get the same value. They're equal. And we should thank the computational gods that that's true, because that's what allows us to solve LP models. Right? The primal and dual certify that each other's optimal. All right, and that's all that this picture is. This picture, I saying the tour is equal to the dual solution is because they're optimal, just an application of von Neumann. The linear programming model is called the subtour LP, the subtour relaxation of the TSP. You have a variable for every edge that tells you whether that edge is in the tour or not. So for every pair of nodes, you have a variable. For every node that you want to visit, you have an equation saying the sum of the variables hitting it has to be 2. Well, because you have to visit the node. And well, that unfortunately would allow disjoint circuits. So to get rid of that, you have for every subset of nodes, you have an inequality saying the sum of the edges hitting that subset has to be at least 2. And von Neumann's dual variables for the equations are the disks, and the dual variables for the subtour inequalities are those bands. Right? That's really nice. And that solves that instance of the TSP, but you can see there's an immediate problem. There's exponentially many of those subtour inequalities. This is 50 points. You couldn't even write down the 2 to the 50 subsets. That's what Danzig, Volcker, and Johnson, their cutting plane method handles. How to handle LP problems when you have far too many constraints. What they do is to just make the simple observation that if you have a solution to an LP and it satisfies your inequalities, well, then you don't need to write them down. It's already satisfied them. So that allows them to generate their inequalities on the fly as they're needed. So they'll work in rounds. They'll solve the LP and then check. Does it satisfy all the inequalities? Yes, I'm done. If not, they add some of them and resolve. So I'll show it running. I'll show both the primal and dual solution. The dual solution are these geometric regions. The primal solution are the variables. The initial solution has these edges actually have value 2 because there's nothing restricting it to being 2. He's going to slowly add in the variables also for having less than or equal to 1. So you watch how it goes. So step by step, it'll go in 8 rounds altogether. And at that point, it stops. And now we have that picture that I showed before. This is showing that tour is optimal. So it's only 8 stops, which was remarkable, right? Because there's 2 to the 50th constraints about. And yet it solved in 8 rounds. And it wasn't just lucky. You give me a 1,000,000-point problem, this will solve in a small number of rounds. But there's a great theoretical weakness in that there's no known polynomial bound on the number of rounds needed. That's really disappointing, right? This is just the first step in our solution approach to the TSP. And yet you're already leaving polynomial algorithms behind you. Right? It's really bad. You could see why, though, it's difficult to prove such a thing. I'll run the same example and just notice that as we add inequalities, the dual solution is changing, sort of global changes. It makes it very difficult to analyze. So it gets it in 8 steps, but it's just up to now, no one's been able to prove that there is some polynomial bound on the number of rounds needed. Yeah, that's really disappointing. But you might say, well, Bill, why are you hoping to get a polynomial time algorithm? There's exponentially many constraints, right? You can't even write it down, so why do you think you can solve it? Well, the number of constraints isn't really the issue. A very similar problem was solved by Jack Edmonds. So very similar dual solution was found by Jack Edmonds in the 1960s for his matching algorithm. And he gets it sort of incrementally, just makes small changes to the dual solution that beautifully gets the transition from one to the other. His algorithm is a little complicated. I implemented it to run on an iPad, and there'll be music, because that's the way I wrote the app, to set it to music. So what he's doing is the green regions are getting bigger, the black regions are getting, the red regions are getting smaller. So they alternate between green, red, green, red, and then he makes that change. So it's more complicated than the cutting plane method, but it runs in polynomial time. And it's just beautiful, I think, the way he just slowly makes more and more edges available to him in his primal solution, and eventually has a similar picture. The only difference is that he's only trapping in odd number points, because he's matching up nodes in pairs. So if you have an odd number, you have to use one edge leaving the set. So only has odd sets. That's the only difference between his LP and the subtour LP. His LP runs in polynomial time. No such method is known for the subtours. It'd be brilliant if we could find that, but we don't have one. All right, but as far as getting the solution, though, we can still rely on the cutting plane method. This made a cutting plane method running on that same example. It takes only 6 rounds, and it'll get the solution. This I just added to music for fun. Yeah, so that's it. So it solved it. There's no regrets. And von Neumann doesn't lie. The value of the dual solution is equal to the value of the primal. The regret is, though, that that's not a Tor. Right? It has these red edges are carrying a value half. See, linear programming doesn't force the variables to be 0, 1. They can be fractions. And the subtour LP relaxation can be fractional. Actually, the referee for their paper, the Danzig, Folks, and Johnson paper, didn't believe that there could be any fractions. Right? They came back and these loop conditions are subtours. He just doesn't believe that you need anything beyond that, which must have been very disappointing for our heroes, because the whole point of their paper was how you deal with those fractional solutions. But he didn't get mad. I mean, a week later, Folks then writes back and he just provides a 6-point example saying, well, look, this one is a fractional solution to the subtour LP. So that's their main problem, fractions. Their solution, the Danzig, Folks, and Johnson solution, is just to keep going with the cutting plane method, just to go beyond subtour inequalities. Right? To add a cutting plane, all you need to do is have a linear inequality that's satisfied by all tours, but violated by that. So you think of it geometrically, you have this polyhedron of your solutions, and you have a fraction, and you're cutting it off. That's what's called the cutting plane method. And the theoretical justification for that is the old theorem by Minkowski in convex geometry, that you can interpret as saying that there's always a cutting plane. If you have a fractional solution in this context, there's always going to be something you can cut it off. So if you take the convex hull of the solutions, the solution vectors, take their convex hull as a polyhedron. That's what Minkowski proved. And so you can always take one of Minkowski's inequalities and cut it off. So you can always do it. There's always money in the cutting plane method. I showed how Danzig, Folks, Johnson, how they solve it, the 48 states problem. I won't be able to write the dual solutions because this was not a geometric problem. They got their distances from an atlas. They were driving distances. But you see that it just rips through the fractional solutions. Sometimes they're half integers, sometimes they're integer. But eventually, after only 9 inequalities, out of all the possible inequalities, only 9, and they solved the problem. You have to remember, they did this by hand. Right? It's not like they have a fancy LP software and they call it. They did this with by hand computations. It's remarkable. So they used 7 subtour inequalities and 2 further inequalities. Actually, this is not what they used. This is what I used when I did it. They had slightly different inequalities. But I used 2 inequalities called combs that were developed by Vasek Kvatel and later extended by Grocho and Padberg. All right, so that's the cutting plane method. You find inequalities violated by your solution and repeatedly add it. And this has had a huge influence in optimization, right? So not just for the TSP, for a big swath of problems where you need integer solutions, that's the cutting plane method. It's how it's used. So you have to like the last line in their paper. Maybe these ideas might be useful somewhere. Right? This is probably the most important paper ever written in discrete optimization. They said, well, maybe they might be okay. For the TSP itself, it took many years for people to understand even what they did. what I'm plotting here are the largest challenge instances obviously you can make a TSP just everybody on a circle and say, I solved the big TSP. That's not the point. These are challenge instances that people really wanted to have solved. What I'm plotting is the year and then when they were solved. And you see there's this big gap between Danzig's solution and the first one that's ever bigger, even though computers came online in the 60s. It took a long time for people to start duplicating it. But note that this chart is in log scale. So once the community understood what was happening, there's this nice linear fit. So it's sort of like we're growing exponentially fast in our ability to solve those problems. So the 70s and 80s were dominated by a crowd, by Grotjol, Padberg, Rinaldi. They sort of developed the techniques that led to our Concord code. So since 1992, all the records have been solved by Concord with Applegate, Bixby, and Quatel. More recently, with Daniel Espinosa, Marcos Cuculier, and Kjeld Elskum. The previous record, the 2000 city problem, actually solves on an iPhone, not this time, on my other iPhone, solves in only 8 seconds on an iPhone 15. All right, so that's nice, but then you pick up a newspaper and they say that you shouldn't even bother trying to solve more than a handful of points. That's pretty disappointing. But you have to say, well, all right, think of it, you're in a journalist's point of view. So we solve those dozen challenge instances. Yeah, maybe we're just overfitting. Maybe we've done all of our energies to solve those, and we can't solve a general problem. Well, I could say that we've also solved 100 million random instances, ranging from 10 points up to 2,000 points. So these have two types. You're taking points in a unit square and Euclidean distance, rounded to the nearest integer, or you're on a torus and taking the Euclidean distance. It's not Euclidean, it's a straight line distance where you identify the edges of the square. The reason we did those studies goes back to a 1939 paper by Mahalalobis, who's the great Indian statistician. He was a great man. He was interested very much in income inequality, and he wanted to propose to the government that they make, he's a Bengali, that they do a sample of jute farming. Jute is this material, sort of this heavy brown material they make bags out of. He wanted to do a random sample of their farms. The main cost was in moving people and equipment from place to place to the random points. So in his proposal to the government, he had to estimate what the cost would be. So what would be the length of the tour? It's interesting because he's apparently doing this without knowing the challenges of Menger and Whitney. And I find it interesting, he doesn't propose any algorithm for finding the tour, he's just estimating its length. And he gives informal proof that it's proportional to the square root of n. It's pretty clear that he could have given a proof if he wanted to, but he's writing for the government, so he's just giving this sort of a vague idea. So he says it's roughly proportional to the square root of n. So I'll try to show that. So this is for n equals 50, where I've taken the length of the optimal tour divided by the square root of n. And you get this nice normal distribution, but with a big variance. Now, I'll increase n equals 50 up to 2,000, and what you'll see is that the mean will decrease a little bit, but the main thing is the variance will shrink down. So it gets a tighter and tighter distribution. In 1959, a team led by Gillian Beardwood, so the BH8 theorem, it's a famous theorem in the TSP, showed that will continue and will spike around a given value of beta. So you give many points in unit square, the optimal value is going to be, with probability 1, beta times the square root of n. We just don't know what beta is. They just gave some rough bounds for beta. I actually was very curious about this because Gillian Beardwood, this is the only theoretical paper that she wrote. So it took me a couple of days. I finally found Gillian Beardwood as working as retired. This was a few years ago. But I found her and then I wrote to her and I was very happy that I was able to correspond with her. This was in 2019 because she died the following year in 2020. And after she confirmed, yeah, I am the Jill Beardwood, she asked, well, how far have you progressed the problem? Well, that was a little bit hard to say because in all those years that passed, since 1959, it's only gone up by epsilon, almost no difference in the bounds. These TSP problems seem to be difficult, these to make improvements. So what we could do, we couldn't prove any theorem, but we want to do with our computation, try to make it estimate. So you can see that we're decreasing as n gets bigger. So we could, with David Johnson, David Applegate, and Neil Sloan, we at least made a computational estimate. So the target is that the lower bound is probably closer to being true than the upper bound that they have. The upper bound, remember, was at 0.9. That probably could be greatly decreased. All right, that's 100 million problems. To me, those guys worked out all the statistics. I was just solving the problems. And for me, it was very comforting to know that 100 million problems, none of them failed. Yeah, all right, then in 2015, there's this worldwide news story about somebody who found a driving tour through some 50 points in the US. And all the stories say that it's impossible to solve. We just solved 100 million problems and they say it's impossible to solve. Well, then there you can also sort of forgive the journalists. Because if you look at the list of challenge problems and those 100 million points, all of them are Euclidean distances, straight line distances. Only 2 of them were actually driving problems. But the trouble is that it's still a bit hard to get data for a big driving problem. So you young people don't know what maps are. Maps used to be this abstract representation of a geographic area. And they used to come with these tables that tell you the distances. And that's how those problems came. All right, so what we did together with Marcos, Daniel, and Kjeld, we solved not for 50 points, but for 50,000, nearly 50,000 or more. So these were walking or biking distances problems where we got the data from either some private companies or from Google or from the open source routing machine. The most recent one is a walking towards some 82,000 bars in Korea that we solved earlier this year. That's a big problem, and these problems, we solved it, but it's not like we're solving on the iPhone. This took, if you added up all the processor cores that we used, it was 44 CPU years. Which sounds like a lot, but because you're thinking polynomial time means fast, but you have to realize the input size is n squared, right? You're getting this distance matrix n squared. If you take any n to the 4th operations, it takes over 200 years to do, even on a fast computer now. So we're solving it in 44 years, so you shouldn't think that, well, polynomial time is definitely, a linear time algorithm would be great, but just to scale the problem, that they do take time to solve. There's actually another way to visit the complexity, to talk about the complexity of a problem, rather than just the running time. So I sort of lied to say that, well, we're using the cutting plane method. We do use the cutting plane method. And Mikowski says that there's always money in the cutting plane method. You can always do more and more cutting planes. The trouble is you add inequalities, and it only improves the LP by a tiny bit. So what we do is we embed it into the Land and Doig branch and bound algorithm. This, by the way, she's still alive. She ran a mini marathon, so she's around 90. Ran a mini marathon. Elsa Land died a few years ago, but Elsa Doig, who was voted not the Australian mathematician of the year, also Australian citizen of the year recently. Quite remarkable. They invented the branch and bound, which means that you want to subdivide the search space. So this USA problem has that red edge, value half. So you split the search space in 2, saying, well, set that variable to 0 or set it equal to 1. And then independently use the cutting plane method on those 2 subproblems. So you end up getting a tree, and then at each leaf of the tree has value bigger than or equal to your best known tour. Then you solve the problem. The name of the game is to have a small tree. Right? Obviously, if you don't do any cutting planes, you'll just enumerate everything. But combining that branch and bound with cutting planes is how we solve the problem. And you see, for the Korean, we made some major adjustments in our strategy to how we're doing the branch and bound. And see, the number of search nodes went down dramatically, only 2,000. That's why we're able to solve that problem. Okay, it's the Korean bar. So why did I choose bars? Well, because bars are fun. People like that. And what was the point of fun is that at the same time as we're solving this Korean bar, Stephen Colbert is going to tens of millions of people all believe we can't solve a 22-city problem at the same time as we're solving this 50,000 one. So in that respect, at least it was a little bit successful that a Korean student made a video about our tour and it has 1.1 million views. Okay, it's not Stephen Colbert, but I don't think it's too much to hope that at least a few of those people reading it will look further into optimization and maybe realize that some of these TSPs is a way to study general optimization. It was also the number 1 story on Hacker News for a couple of days when it first came out. It's again good. But I have to say there's a weakness here so we changed the algorithm. I wrote new code to implement a new version, and we solved one example. maybe we're just lucky. And the trouble is it takes 44 years. So it's not like you can do thousands of these examples and actually show, yeah, this is a robust method. But one nice thing about computation is there's always a bigger problem. So to try to show the method is capable of solving more problems of that size, I'm running on a larger problem. So it's currently running on 102,000 bars and restaurants in Japan. It hasn't quite solved it, but it's really close. So this is walking in seconds. So it's about a year and a half, and I know it's within 13 seconds of the shortest possible tour. Probably it'll solve by the end of the year. So running on a big machine. But I have to say that this size of the problem, it's not just cutting planes. At this point, the linear programming solver is becoming a bottleneck. The LPs are getting hard to solve. You can really see that point driven home if you look at the logs for the 2 million star problem that we worked on with Keld. There, the commercial LP solver is essentially taking all of the time. Right? So you find cutting plane in a second, it takes a day before you know the next result. So it's impossible to do research further when you're having that type of computation. So when we tried to get this up into even larger instances, we had to start looking at other LP technology. So how we handled the 2 million was by randomization. For the two largest instances these are all star instances from various databases, with this one with 1 million, 100 million, and 200 million stars. Those we couldn't even run the cutting plane method. I gathered all the inequalities I thought I would need, made one big linear programming problem, and gave it to Dave Applegate, who led a team at Google that made a first order approximation algorithm for handling large LPs. Why Google wanted to do it, I don't know, but they're very keen on testing their algorithm on these big LPs. So for these two big ones, the approximation factor is very good. It's better than 1.5, right? It's 1.3 zeros and then 1.8 or 2.5. I would really like to get the fourth zero. The reason is that commercial discrete optimization codes, integer programming codes, that's their optimality tolerance. If they get 4 zeros, they stop. They say you're optimal. So I really would like to get the fourth zero. Let me try to explain where the gap comes from. So in this 100 million node problem, so we have a lower bound, and there's the real optimality tour, right? So first off, Keld Helsken found the tour for us with his code using various local search techniques. His tour might not be optimal, so there's a gap between our tour and what Keld found. All right, then there's a gap between the optimal tour length and the optimal LP value. That's probably a big gap. I probably didn't give exactly the right. I'm not Minkowski. I didn't know exactly inequalities. I just gathered what I thought were good to give to Dave. So that's probably a big gap. Dave doesn't actually solve the LP. He has a first order method that gets an approximate solution. So there's a gap between our LP and the optimal LP. And I didn't give Dave all n squared variables, right? That's 100 million squared. I couldn't give them all of them. I had to select variables that I thought these were the important ones, then use von Neumann duality to figure out what penalty did I have to pay for not giving him all those edges. So that's another part of the gap. That last one, actually, no, that's 3%. I had to make that computation in order to get the rebound. The first one, we didn't really have any expectation of whether Keld had solved the problem or not, because there's no real basis for testing on 100 million points. But I was really happy that using LP information, Keld lowered the value of the tour. Initially, we had one value, and he decreased it by some 15% of the gap using the LP information. And each day, well, not each day, but every several days, I always check on it. He gets a little bit better every few days. So as longer we wait, the lower it gets. All right, so that's that gap. Most of the gap, though, I still think is between the optimal length and the optimal LP value. I just gave Dave the wrong, that's my fault. The optimal value and our LP value, that would be Dave's fault. He just didn't solve the LP. Actually, I think that's only really small because he's giving primal and dual solutions. So the big picture is, I think is great. I just couldn't believe it when Dave sent back the dual solution for that 100 million node problem. Right, that he could compute something with many billions of non-zeros in the matrix. I just found that amazing. But it's all a little delicate. So a year ago, I made even a much bigger LP that I think would get the bound that I want. But Google so far hasn't been able to put together the software and hardware to do this bigger LP. It's a difficult challenge. But I'm still optimistic that we'll eventually do this. Even looking at the bigger picture, there was a nice article in the New York Times in 1991. It says, math problem long baffling slowly yields. They're talking about progress on sort of modest-sized problems, but still practical progress on solving them. But it says slowly yields. That was 1991. I have to say very slowly yields. These are the timelines of these three of the most prominent theoretical problems on the TSP. When you say there's essentially no progress on those in the last 50 years, just epsilon progress. Very difficult, these theoretical problems. But also computationally. David Johnson, as part of a conference he organized, he had this challenge instance with 100,000 random points. Not designed to defeat our method, just random points. And we haven't been able to solve it in 25 years. I mean, we're pretty close. We have the 4 zeros in the approximation. And not only that, we could prove that certain edges can't be in any optimal tour. So we have reduced it down to 241,000 edges. So we reduced the complete graph down to 1 on degree 5. Not only that, we fixed 26,000 edges we know have to be in every tour. So we have a lot of information, but we haven't solved it. Right? We just don't know enough about the LP. It's not about the TSP. The linear programming problems solve fine. It's just we don't know enough about cutting planes. So the situation is you have this fractional solution that's rather complex. These colored edges go across this band. And you have to stare them down and somehow get inequalities that would increase your bound. So it's a nice mix of mathematics using geometry, combinatorics, algorithms, data structure, engineering, computation, all stirred together in order to try to push the limits of solvability. It'd be nice if some of you would also consider this as a research area. I mean, as motivation, I can point out that many of the household names in discrete optimization that are used all the time for practical problem solving arose first in TSP research. So simulated annealing, branch and bound, cutting planes, these all came from TSP papers. So that's the motivation for the community, why the community could benefit, but why would you benefit? Well, if you like to win money, there's not only 100,000 Amazon, Keld Helsk and I also won the end of the year Kaggle competition a few years ago on TSP related problem. We solved some $17,000. And Kaggle actually just announced a new problem 2 years. Each year they have an end of year competition. So if you like to win money, well, maybe the TSP. I can also say that through my work, I won a fake award given by a Korean magazine. They just didn't like the way that like the Academy Awards, they have these big awards for art, but not for mathematics. And not only the fake award, they gave me fake hair to better match the Fields Medal winner, Peter Schulze, who does have long hair, who also received a fake award. So, if you want to get fake hair, maybe the TSP is the way to do it. You could also win real awards. Ola Svensson won the Held Prize. Actually, it's the Held from Held Karp. When he died, he donated money for algorithmic research. He won $100,000 for his work on TSP. Vera Traub, when she was a student at Bonn, she won the $50,000 Mira Saccani Prize, the Breakthrough Prize, again for work on the TSP. I'll show her the announcement for winning it. This is Jin Yun Park, who's another winner of the Mira Saccani Prize.
Works in combinational optimization. For example, traveling salesman problems. Questions like, if you have to make a delivery in several neighborhoods, what is the most efficient route that visits each of them only once?
I'm glad you got all the big words.
Yeah.
So this was broadcast live on American television. It's a big thing each year, the Breakthrough Prize. That's Danny DeVito and Odom. He's a famous television actor and he played in the Broadway musical Hamilton. That same ceremony, the Jin Yun Park and Vera Traub are appearing on the stage with will.i.am, who is a famous rap singer in America in the band Black Eyed Peas.
Yo, give it up to the awesome people that are helping change the world. Thank you guys so much.
So if you want to meet rap stars, maybe you should work on the TSP. If you want to meet your president or chancellor or prime minister, these are all famous TSP researchers that I mentioned in the talk, all meeting their heads of state. So if you do want to meet high people in the government, TSP research may be the ticket. Maybe the most important reason, though, is came back to this story that Nikos Christovidis told me. Well, didn't tell me, wrote to me in an email some years ago, that he met Feynman at a conference. Feynman was not part of the conference, it was in Stanford. Just happened to say, now, what are you working on? And he described the TSP. Then Feynman went home. The next day came back, yeah, you're right, that's a hard problem. Have fun, kid. So, and he's right, that the TSP is just, you put your arms around it. It's really like a problem you can really understand, and yet it somehow captures complexity. You make progress on it, you can have progress in many different diverse areas. So the great computer scientist, Richard Karp, said the most thrilling thing he ever had in his science was the night that he got these numbers from his algorithm with help. It came back from the computer. Christoph Papadimitriou said the TSP is not a problem, it's an addiction. Well, I'm sample number one. I've been working on this for like 40 years, the TSP. So it's definitely addictive, but I don't think it's one we should try to cure. It's just the opposite. If I had little candies, I'd put TSP wrappers in it and toss them out to try to get people hooked on the problem. Because again, it captures this complexity. There may be big optimization breakthroughs on the horizon, and we just need new ideas. So thank you.